Welcome to Raw Talent, a podcast from Shore Capital Partners focused on the real work of developing people and building stronger organizations. In this series, members of our talent development team have candid conversations about what it really takes to grow leaders and strengthen teams. Talent development is not just a program. It's the everyday work of coaching, feedback, stretch opportunities, and accountability that shapes performance over time. Each episode explores the real challenges companies face when developing people and the lessons learned along the way. Welcome back.
Thanks.
This is the fourth episode of Raw Talent.
Yeah.
We're going to talk about how do you effectively scale your development programs without making it a one-size-fits-all moment. How do you really start to think about scaling the community, scaling the principles, and not just like the content on the slides. And what that means is, how do you balance this personalization versus consistency? How do you give people the relevant development without custom building everything, which is something we kind of go back and forth on? How do you live in that tension? How do you create a culture inside of your company where it's everybody's job to train and to learn and to share? And how do you really intentionally build that community?
Yeah. That's a big one.
Yeah.
You have any ideas?
Well, I think maybe we could start by, where do we see organizations potentially overcorrect, where they go too generic or too custom?
I think too generic becomes the easiest. It's where it gets too generic and it ends up being something that's like professional development becomes equivalent to some standardized onboarding or something like that got built 5 years ago and hasn't evolved with the company, or, because that we invested in that and we had the tools to deliver that, and that's a basic standing. So I think, that's where you get a little over generic, or they pick a platform that offers professional development content and then provide access to that platform and say, here's your professional development. So one is like narrowing it and neutering it. Mm-hmm. The other is broadening it, but in broadening it, it doesn't have any teeth or real gravitas. So, you've got some smart person on some web-based platform who's talking about topic X, again, to our previous episodes, that doesn't know anything about what it's like to work inside of your small manufacturing, your mom and pop TPA, your dental practice, whatever it might be.
The impact of that is that, hungry learners are able to connect those dots.
Yeah.
But on the flip side, if something ends up being too specific, these disengaged learners who are just there to check the box of doing this development start to pick apart the lack of relevance in some of those scenarios.
Yeah, totally. You get something and goes, oh, well, I mean, they said that they were in Tennessee and I work in Ohio, so this scenario couldn't possibly relate to, once it gets so narrow, the people who are slightly defiant and don't want to be doing this extra work anyway will start to bash every nuance that's not perfectly matched to their scenario or their role.
And even still, though, the more accurate or the more specific the situations, the scenarios are, the more likely it is that people are able to see themselves in that and apply the learning. So it's still that balance.
Yeah. And I think the way we think about it is like, what's the conversation that needs to be had?
It's like standardize the learning goal.
Yeah. What needs to be talked about, not how do they need to be talking about it? And how do you prime that conversation? How do you prime that situation, that conversation within a team, that conversation with a customer, whatever? And I mean, we had an example not long ago where we did, maybe a page long scenario with an executive team in an early company. And we had done our research and aligned it with the company, talked through it with the CEO. So we knew we had the details right. Somebody wasn't going to start picking it apart, to your example before. But what we saw happen was an extraordinary moment. We actually had the same thing happen about 2 months later with another executive team. Is this scenario conversation, again, going to the spirit of what's the conversation this executive team needs to be having? And you set up a scenario, and in this case, we set it up as if they were having an executive team meeting. And about 7 or 8, because I was watching the clock and I had it, facilitator timer, something happened and I didn't know it had happened. And so I was like, all right, 1 more minute or whatever. I don't remember the details. And like, no. CEO was like, no. We're going to keep having this conversation. Well, without even me knowing it, they had transitioned from the scenario-based conversation that had so been the right conversation for them to be having that they switched the data out basically, and we're actually having a real executive team meeting in that moment.
Yeah.
Talking about like, okay, let's not talk about this in the abstract. Let's talk about this and how I know you're thinking. Like that was like a wow kind of magic moment. If you keep an eye on your objective and not your content, and you do your homework in setting up the situational information accurately, you're not going to get that every time. That's a symbiosis between the team wanting it and you being able to set it up. Those have to marry.
Yeah, I mean, you talk about this a lot when we develop content and sessions for folks. There's a flow that needs to be true in these development sessions. And I think what's interesting, you mentioned, like you gave that example, but you mentioned that 2 months later we had a very similar example,
We did.
which we can speak to.
Yeah.
But we've actually done a similar session like that across 4 different C-suites at this point.
Yeah.
They all happened within a couple of months time frame.
And in very different stages.
Very different stages.
Yeah.
Actually, just coming on to the hold.
Yeah.
And
all
post-cap.
stages. Yeah. Yeah.
And the reality is that what remained true for us when we approached the design and the facilitation is we knew what the learning outcomes were. We knew that relational strategy, relational understanding, what triggers were for that team needed to be taught and had a conversation.
Yeah.
We knew where the practice moments needed to happen and the discussion needed to happen inside of that flow. And that remained true. That's 85% of all 4 of those engagements.
Yeah. Yeah.
But the remaining 15% was the customized scenario in which they practiced and in which they had the discussion.
Yeah.
And that's how you strike that balance.
Yeah.
You know what has to be true in terms of the conversation, but the world that you build for them to be able to practice and discuss is where the magic happens.
Yeah. And I think if I extrapolate that out to sort of your larger question about trying to scale this, that same logic is true. So the way I translate some of that is in the arc of your development, you have to make sure people are ready for the next thing.
Mm.
And part of how they make sure they're ready for the next thing is they don't see the next thing as an isolated, here's the December session, here's the January session, here's the February session, but rather there's a narrative. And while those were like single day sessions or multi-day sessions intensive with a team, I think that logic is true, even if you're thinking about a once a month company wide. You can't drop stuff on people, conversations, challenges, business challenges, problems, whatever, that they're not ready to tackle. And so you have to recognize if it's been a month since you last did something, you've got to spend some time connecting the dots of where you've been and pace getting to that conversation. I'll use that generically. Whatever that objective is for your professional development is going to take time, but it still requires sequence and logically thinking through, even with our multi-month engagements, we talk about influence before we talk about problem solving.
Mm-hmm.
We talk about problem solving before we talk about conflict management. We talk about conflict management before we talk about team engagement. Because from the position of someone learning, what's in their face and what's in their control and the sequence of those conversations matters to their ability to absorb that next conversation, that next set of information or content framework.
Yeah. This is all in the context of formal development programs. It's in the context of, designing kind of a suite of tools. But another way that you can scale learning inside of your organization is to transform your organization into a teaching and learning organization. What has to be true to see a shift towards that type of culture?
Everybody's got to be invested in. So I talk about it as everybody has a chance to learn. Everybody has a chance to teach. The person answering your phones knows something about your customers that you don't know.
Mm-hmm.
Have you ever asked? The technician knows something about the quality of your data that somebody else doesn't know. Have you ever asked? And if people know they're going to be asked their opinion and their perspective, they're going to pay more attention. If they know they're never going to be asked, they're just going to do their job. I mean, one of the things that I really appreciate, twice a year, we get asked as part of Shore from Justin, if you were in my position, what would you do to make this a better place to work? If you were in my position, what would you do to make this a better investment firm? And because we're asked, we pay attention.
Mm-hmm.
And so part of this becomes like, if I'm asking you, and I'm truly, genuinely asking you, you're now the teacher.
Mm-hmm.
It doesn't have to be you can do a lunch and learn, you can do whatever. But if I'm just asking you, what insights have you seen? Have you seen any shifts in the challenges people are facing in X, Y, and Z? Have you seen, now you're the teacher.
Yeah.
That reciprocity of teaching and learning has to be there to scale, because you can't have everything come through a program or come through a position. Everything can't funnel through HR or whatever. It's got to be ubiquitous. You don't pick Monday morning at 8 o'clock to do your parenting. Everything is in the flow and in the context of what you're experiencing.
Yeah. And I think I want to kind of dig into a nuance here too, though. Sure, it doesn't have to be and doesn't need to be always like this formal program Mondays at 8 a.m., but you can systematize it.
Sure.
And in fact, one of the best leaders I ever had a checklist of how many times they talked to the people that they led in a given week.
Yeah.
And they had just set it into their culture that on their drive home from work, they would call 2 people and ask a question. What would have made your experience better today? And that's just what they did on their drive home.
I love that. That's
and
fantastic.
then it's just this idea that, and oftentimes it wasn't just the people that they managed, it was skip level. And it was just, I know that if I get this phone call, I'm not in trouble.
Yeah. Well, that's part of it too, right?
I'm
like
just getting
that's normal.
It's exciting. Like, oh, I know. Look who's calling me.
Yeah.
And then I get to have this really informal conversation. I get to hear the blinker. I get to hear the brakes. I get to hear all those things. And it just becomes a human interaction.
Yeah.
But that's systematized, but not formal.
Yeah. Yeah. No, that's a great example, and is a great model. This is a complicated answer, but a simple answer is you have to have the relationships in place.
Yeah.
And those calls are not just feedback calls or teaching learning calls, they're relationship calls.
Yeah.
And they're trust building calls. And the companies and teams that struggle with this stuff struggle because their relationships can't sustain a difficult conversation. Think about your best relationships. You can talk to the people about anything and the relationship is still strong. Think about the people you trust the most. They can tell you anything and it might hurt, but if you trust them, you know it's coming from a good place, even if you disagree with them. And so you have to come back to some of those things that get cultivated in little interactions every day, little phone calls, little pass the cube, a little nod, a little recognition. All of that stuff is building your resilience for when stuff is really tough. And so it's like, it's the trust bank, so to speak. You don't start build. This was one of the things going back to the first part of this conversation. I was evaluating a third-party content tool, and they had even trying to make the cell curated for me what they thought was the best of the best. And the first video I watched, which was their highest rated video in the first minute, was about difficult conversation or conflict management. I don't remember.
Right.
Lesson number 1, you have to build trust. Wrong. If you're trying to build trust when you're in the midst of a difficult conversation, you're losing. You're building trust every day up to that difficult conversation so that you can draw on it in that difficult conversation.
Mm-hmm.
And that's the stuff that when it comes to scaling, this is why culture is so important, has to be an expectation about how we treat each other, how we communicate, how we give shout outs, how we give feedback, the expectation that we're all fallible, which means we all can learn and must learn. All of those things have to be true to truly scale. They're never going to all be true. They have to be aspirationally true.
Yeah. I think one thing that I'm hearing you talk about, these micro moments of trust.
Yeah.
And doing it proactively. And that actually brings up a thought of those formal moments of learning and development, they can and often are moments that break trust because they feel so
It's
out
true.
of pocket.
Yeah.
But I think advice that I would have for leaders is that when you do create those formal training, those formal development moments, how you design those, who you elevate, and how you position the facilitation of those things can build trust too.
Yeah,
Like
for sure.
if you have a best practice of how you want your front office to run at your practice, don't just be the leader who comes in and says, this is how you do it. Position employee A, who you know does it well and excellent every single day. Let them be the one that role plays. Let them be the one that models. Let them be the
Yeah.
one that walks through what they do when the client comes in the door.
Yeah.
Like you position those people to be the experts.
Yeah.
You position your folks not to solve as the leader. You know, we talked earlier about like coaching questions. You can run things like leadership labs like we do.
Yeah.
Like actually speak to that a little bit about leadership
Yeah.
labs and how that could empower a company to build trust because it's not just the leader,
Yeah.
it's us
Yeah.
solving.
Yeah. I mean, our leadership labs process is one that I used years ago and you sort of brought back into this work. I had not been using it, but it's just a structured conversation where I identify as a participant a leadership challenge I'm wrestling with, and I partner with you and two or three other people, and y'all all do the same thing. And I have a few minutes of structured time to share my challenge, and then I have to shut up. And I have to sit and listen to the two or three other people solve, address, ask questions about my challenge where I can't speak, where I can't go, oh, no, I tried that. I can't go, oh, well, this person won't. I can't give all the excuses that cut off that conversation. I have to sit there for a period of time and watch them wrestle with my challenges in ways that I perhaps haven't thought of or are nuanced or reinforce ways that I have. And then I get to sort of come back and ask clarifying questions and so forth. But just structuring that around real world challenges is a great and sort of democratizing experience because everybody's facing some kind of a challenge. And everybody only has one mind that they're able to put on it if they're just keeping it to themselves. And this gives you that chance to open that up. You know, one thing I do want to go back to that you were describing earlier about that leader enabling and empowering the person who's the best practice to be recognized, not just as the best practice, but in teaching, even if it's not like they don't have to become the teacher, you support them, but you lift them up and put them in the position, you know, and plus peer to peer, everybody knows like that connection and that authenticity is really important. There was another thing I wanted to layer on top of that from the leadership perspective that is a, a brutal breach of trust that may be obvious, but can't go unstated. A leader brings in a facilitator to talk about conflict management because there's conflict on their team and they're the ones driving all the conflict and have no self-recognition or it's about feedback or about EQ and they're the ones that blow up in meetings and tell people off. And so part of scaling leadership means that those principles and those values and those insights and those frameworks are lived to the top of the organization and modeled at the top of the organization, because no matter how much you invest down here, if what's being modeled up here runs counter to that, it isn't going to scale.
Mm-hmm.
And a lot of people get in a position of power and look and say, oh, those people need to fix that problem over there. And what they don't recognize is they're mirroring that behavior. Not to keep bringing it back to parenting, but hey, that's what I do in my non-work time. But when you have a kid and they start mirroring your behavior, that's a real moment of honesty.
Yeah.
Right? That doesn't always get seen in the same way in a business context, but that's part of scaling professional development, scaling these kinds of principles. It's got to happen at the top too.
Yeah. I think that's a great place to leave it for this episode. When I think about kind of the recap and how I would think about this, scaling development isn't just about cloning programs.
Yeah.
It's how do you create repeatable systems across your organization? Because the reality is that your best content is probably already in your company. It's real people solving real problems, and you just need to figure out ways to elevate that.
Yep.
All right, so for our next episode, It's our final episode.
Oh,
We are going to cover how do we know if it's working? Like, how do we know that talent development is worth it and it's actually having an impact?
great.
If you enjoyed this episode, check out other Raw Talent episodes at www.shorecp.university/podcasts or anywhere you get your podcasts. Here you will find our Bigger, Stronger, Faster, Microcap Moments, and Everyday Heroes series, each highlighting the people and stories that make investing in the lower middle market unique. This podcast was narrated by Jackson Sprayberry, created and produced by Austin Johnson, editing by Podhouse Productions. This podcast is the property of Shore Capital Partners, LLC. None of the content herein is investment advice, an offer of investment advisory services, nor a recommendation or offer relating to any security. See the Terms of Use page on the Shore Capital website for other important information.